February 15th, 1943. 12 American tank destroyers surge forward at Kasserine Pass. Within minutes, every vehicle is burning. A company erased, not through incompetence, but because a daring seek, strike, and destroy doctrine and World War I-era guns met German Tiger tanks and 88mm cannons. The result was pure annihilation. This disaster triggered the worst United States defeat in World War II. 3,000 missing, 6,300 total casualties, hundreds of tanks destroyed, and it forced a reckoning with everything the Army believed. How did visionary American theory lead a battalion to annihilation in its very first test? General Leslie J. McNair believed he had solved the problem of the German tank. After France's collapse in 1940, McNair saw that speed and shock, not armor thickness, had carried the day for the Wehrmacht. His answer was not heavier tanks, but a new kind of force, the tank destroyer. The doctrine was codified in February 1942, distributed to every battalion, and drilled into every officer. The tank destroyer was not a substitute for a tank. It was a specialized weapon designed to hunt and kill enemy armor wherever it broke through the line. Doctrine. The core of the doctrine was mobility. Tank destroyers would be held back as a corps or army reserve, not parceled out to support infantry or scattered across the front. When German tanks punched a hole, tank destroyer teams would race to the breach, find concealed positions, and set an ambush. The doctrine was seek, strike, and destroy. The tank destroyer was to be faster than the tank it hunted, with thin armor for speed and a gun with more range and power than any tank on the field. In GHQ Memorandum No. 35, McNair wrote that since the tank must advance, the tank destroyer need only maneuver for a favorable position, conceal itself thoroughly, and ambush the tank. The lightly armored, high-speed destroyer with a potent gun thus becomes the master of the tank. This was a war plan written for the open fields of Europe, where tanks would surge forward, and the tank destroyer would strike from hiding. Thin steel plates, just 6 to 16 millimeters thick, were considered a feature, not a flaw. Weight was the enemy. Speed was survival. The gun, an American-made copy of the French 75mm gun of 1897, was chosen for proven reliability and immediate availability, not for its ability to match the latest German armor. The organization of each battalion was precise. 3 companies, each with 12 self-propelled guns, plus reconnaissance and headquarters elements. Crews drilled in rapid movement, hull-down firing, and the art of vanishing before the enemy could return fire. Speed. The doctrine warned against using tank destroyers in direct support of infantry or in static positions. The memo cautioned they were not for use in direct infantry support or prolonged engagements. They are vulnerable if exposed or used statically. On paper, the theory was elegant. Outmaneuver the tank, strike first, and disappear. The 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion was trained to this blueprint. Every man, every officer, every vehicle. The doctrine promised that with speed, concealment, and surprise, even lightly armored American crews could defeat the best tanks Germany could build. The M3 Gun Motor Carriage was a weapon built for speed, not survival. Its foundation was the M3 half-track, a vehicle designed to haul infantry, not to duel with tanks. The armor was little more than sheet metal, 6 to 16 millimeters at its thickest, barely enough to stop rifle fire. The open-topped fighting compartment left its 5-man crew exposed from every angle. No turret, only a fixed gun mount. If the target moved, the whole vehicle had to pivot. In theory, this meant rapid redeployment. In practice, it meant a crew scrambling to line up a shot while under fire, with every movement telegraphed to the enemy. The crews were exposed. The main armament was a 75mm M1897, a design first fired in 1897 on the battlefields of France. Its armor-piercing rounds could punch through early Panzer III and Panzer IV side plates at close range. But by 1943, German tanks had evolved. The Tiger I's frontal armor measured 100mm, impenetrable to the M3's gun at any practical distance. Even the Panzer IV's upgraded armor could shrug off a direct hit from beyond 500 meters. Meanwhile, the German 88mm flak gun, the most feared anti-tank weapon on the continent, could destroy an M3 at over 2,000 yards. The M3's own gun was only effective at less than half that range, and even then only against weaker side armor. The Tiger was a game-changer. Ballistics tables from US Ordnance told the truth that doctrine ignored. At 500 meters, the M3's 75mm could penetrate about 76mm of armor, enough for a lucky shot on a panzer's flank, useless against a Tiger's front. At 1,000 meters, that figure dropped to 60mm. The German 88mm, by contrast, could punch through over 110mm of armor at the same distance. The engagement envelope was a death sentence. The M3 had to close to within 800 meters to have any hope, but it could be destroyed from 3 times that range. The open compartment was a fatal invitation to artillery and airburst shrapnel. A single mortar round, or a burst from a Stuka's cannon, could wipe out a crew in seconds. Even machine gun fire could kill or wound the men inside. There was no overhead protection, no escape from the blast radius, and no time to bail out when the thin hull was hit. The M3's speed, 45 miles per hour on a paved road, meant little in the mud and rocks of Tunisia, where cross-country movement rarely topped 10 miles per hour. Every technical promise, every theoretical advantage was stripped away by the reality of combat. The weapon designed to hunt tanks became the hunted. The M3 Gun Motor Carriage was not just outmatched. It was obsolete the moment it faced the guns of the Africa Corps. Orders from 2nd Corps arrived with the force of finality. The 805th Tank Destroyer Battalion, trained for speed and surprise, was parceled out piecemeal across the Tunisian front. Instead of waiting in reserve and ready to pounce on enemy armor, the battalion found itself stretched thin, positions scattered along more than 30 miles of winding mountain roads and rocky passes. Each company and each platoon was assigned to reinforce exposed infantry, man checkpoints, or anchor roadblocks. Lieutenant Colonel Robert J. Ormond recognized the danger immediately. In a written protest to higher command, he warned that dispersing his unit this way violated every principle of tank destroyer doctrine. He argued, the battalion cannot mass its firepower, cannot maneuver to meet a breakthrough, and cannot perform its mission as designed. The reply was blunt. Orders would stand. 2nd Corps, under General Fredendall, insisted that the threat of German armor was everywhere and nowhere. Every pass and every approach needed a tank destroyer presence. The result was a patchwork of isolated outposts, each with a handful of M3 GMC vehicles and crews tied to static defensive lines. Attachment logs from February 1943 show elements of the 805th assigned to both the 34th Infantry Division and the 1st Armored Division, sometimes shifting roles overnight as the front buckled and reformed. The battalion's own records note the contradiction, trained for rapid concentration, yet forced into immobility. The men who had drilled in the art of the ambush now dug in behind shallow scrapes, waiting for the enemy to come. Maps from the period show the 805th's positions strung out from the Tebessa Road in the west to the high ground above Sidi Bou Zid in the east. In some sectors, a single half-track and its 5-man crew were all that stood between Rommel's panzers and the American rear. The original doctrine, concentration of force, mobility, concealment, was undone by the reality of command decisions. Ormond's protest became a footnote in the battalion's after-action report, overshadowed by the events that would follow. The 805th was no longer a mobile hunter. It was a static target, exposed and alone, waiting for the storm to break. Rows of young men from Iowa, most barely out of high school, filled the ranks of the 168th Infantry Regiment as they arrived in Tunisia. Farmhands, mechanics, and students, few with more than a handful of weeks in uniform, now faced the brutal mathematics of modern war. In the days before the German attack, the regiment received a shipment of bazookas, the first anti-tank weapons most of these men had ever seen. Training manuals were passed hand to hand. On February 12th, a sergeant demonstrated the weapon's workings to a crowd of recruits who had never fired one, let alone faced a tank in combat. 2 days later, they would be expected to use them against the best armor the Wehrmacht could field. The regiment had just absorbed 450 replacements, many of whom had never completed basic training. Some had never fired a rifle in anger. The lines at Sidi Bou Zid were held together by men who had learned to drill on Iowa fairgrounds, now told to hold their ground against tigers and panzers. The enemy came in waves, tanks, half-tracks, and infantry, supported by Stuka dive bombers that turned the rocky hills into killing zones. As the German assault began on February the 14th, the 168th found itself cut off on high ground. Radio calls for tank destroyer support went unanswered or brought only a handful of M3 half-tracks, dug in along the approaches. The men dug shallow foxholes in rocky soil, clutching bazookas they barely understood. German armor pressed in from all sides. Artillery and machine gun fire swept the American positions. The sky filled with black smoke and the scream of Stukas diving low, their bombs scattering earth and men alike. By the third day, the perimeter collapsed. Of the 2,000 men who had stood at Sidi Bou Zid, only about 300 made it out under cover of darkness. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured, an 85% casualty rate in a single engagement. Letters home stopped arriving. Families in Ottumwa, Cedar Rapids, and Council Bluffs waited for word that would not come. For the survivors, the lesson was seared into memory. No amount of courage or new equipment could overcome a gulf in preparation and experience. The Iowa farm boys had been thrown into a battle for which they were never truly equipped, forced to improvise against a foe that had mastered the art of mechanized war. The cost was measured not just in numbers, but in the sudden, irreversible loss of a generation from small towns across the Midwest. 12 M3 half-tracks rolled forward in a single line, engines straining as they crossed the barren approach toward the German positions. The ground offered no cover, just churned earth and rock. Every silhouette visible against the pale Tunisian scum, C Company's crews braced behind open shields, eyes locked on distant ridgelines. They advanced in daylight, exposed, following orders to punch through and rescue the infantry cut off ahead. Exposed German gunners waited in silence. Their 88mm cannons and tank turrets tracked the American column, holding fire as the range closed. At roughly 800 yards, the kill order was given. The first shells tore through the thin armor of the lead M3, igniting ammunition and scattering the crew. Seconds later, the entire line was bracketed by high explosive and armor-piercing rounds. Each half-track became a target, burning or immobilized within moments. Kill, some crews tried to swing their vehicles to return fire, but the fixed gun mounts forced them to turn the entire half-track under a hail of shrapnel. Others bailed out, only to be caught in machine gun bursts sweeping the open ground. The German fire discipline was absolute. No wasted shots, no hesitation. Within minutes, all 12 vehicles were wrecked. 60 men went in, the company ceased to exist as a fighting force. Wrecked. The terrain offered no escape. the doctrine offered no answer. The 75mm shells bounced off German armor or exploded harmlessly in the dirt. The M3s, designed for speed and maneuver, sat stranded in a place where mobility meant nothing and concealment was impossible. In those few minutes, the gap between theory and reality became a graveyard. News of the disaster at Kasserine Pass reached Allied headquarters with the force of a thunderclap. The casualty lists told the story in cold numbers: over 6,000 Americans killed, wounded, or missing. Equipment losses ran higher than anything the Army had faced: 183 tanks, 104 half-tracks, 208 artillery pieces, and more than 500 trucks left burning or abandoned in the Tunisian hills. For the High Command, excuses evaporated. General Eisenhower relieved 2nd Corps Commander Lloyd Friedendahl, replacing him with George S. Patton, a leader known for discipline and ruthless attention to tactical detail. Orders went out to every armored unit. The era of static defense was over. After-action reports from the 805th and other battalions landed on desks at Army Ground Forces, each one repeating the same conclusion. Tank destroyers could not survive in exposed, static positions. Within weeks, the M3 GMC was on its way out. New shipments of the M10 tank destroyer, featuring a fully enclosed turret and a 3-inch gun, arrived in North Africa. Training shifted overnight. Tank destroyer units now drilled in rapid movement, flanking attacks, and coordination with infantry and artillery. The 805th, re-equipped and reconstituted, returned to the line in March. At El Ghetar, just 1 month after Kasserine, the battalion used its new vehicles as intended, moving fast, striking from concealment, and working in concert with other arms. The result was a decisive victory over the German 10th Panzer Division. The lessons of Kasserine had been written in blood, but the army had absorbed them with astonishing speed. Every modern armored doctrine carries the imprint of Kasserine's failure. It is proof that the battlefield punishes untested theories, not intentions. Today, military planners still study these losses to avoid repeating them. As technology evolves, the lesson holds. Assumptions cost lives when reality intervenes. History's tuition is paid in blood, and its warnings remain as urgent now as they were in the North African sand. What lessons do we ignore at our own risk?